Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. This is episode 29. I'm your host, Barney Smith of StoryComic.com, and we're excited to have with us the internationally respected historian and writer, Andrew Liptak. How's it going, Andrew?
Hi. Internationally famous is probably if you include Canada.
Well, see, it's true though, right? Yeah.
There. It's like the Burlington International Airport is international on a technicality.
So you're coming out with you had an anthology book that came out, but this is the first book that you're coming out that you wrote yourself from the back, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So, that's a blast from the past. 2014, 2015, I co-edited an anthology called War Stories with Jam Gates, and we published it through Apex Publications. And that was our attempt at trying to put a slightly new spin on military science fiction. We didn't want to do sort of like the guts and glory, sort of jingoistic military SF stories that are out there. We wanted to really dig in on stuff that's sort of looking at the impact of warfare. And that comes out of my background from my education. I went to Norwich University in Vermont, and I studied military history. And Jam had connections to the military community herself. So we had met at a con, and we wanted to sort of talk about, what is the, how do we sort of get some really good stories that are sort of looking at the impact of combat and conflict. And that was something that really appealed to us because we had seen the impact either through veterans that we knew ourselves or just looking at the news. And
Right.
Yeah, we published it. It's still sort of, we call it the little book that still chugs along because it still sells, and people, I haven't gotten any emails about it lately, but it seems like people still read it and hopefully are enjoying it. We published some really great stories in it, and some of those authors have gone into really great things, and some are still folks I talk to these days. So, yeah, but this Cosplay History is my first solo project, I guess. And even then, not really quite a solo project because there's a lot of people that sort of helped me along the way.
Right. So talk to us a bit about this, because you have this really interesting background of science fiction. You're part of the Star Wars cosplay scene, and also military history. So you've kind of been able to, you kind of drifted into this direction of really getting into the cosplay scene. So what was your inspiration by putting this book together?
So I talk about this in the introduction of the book. My background with cosplay starts way back in 2003. I was in high school. I had been interested in Star Wars, I should say obsessed with Star Wars since the special editions came out in 1997.
Yep.
I was at just like the perfect age. They really captured my imagination, and I distinctly remember on the way home thinking like, oh, the stormtroopers were really cool. I wish I could dress up as one of them. So I thought about it, like over the years, like, how do I make this armor? For some reason, it didn't really occur to me to make it out of like cardboard. I think I wanted something that was sort of exact and not like cartoony or sort of cobbled together. I wanted an actual stormtrooper. And I was in band. We played Star Wars at my final concert. I think in no small part because I pestered our music director for 6 straight years to play it. And just to sort of make it special, I was like, all right, how do we really make it, memorable? And I had known about the 501st Legion. And I convinced my music teacher to say, hey, we should invite these guys up. And we sent out an invite, and one of them came up, a guy named Scott Allen. And we played the music. He walked in at the right time. The crowd went wild. And after the concert was over, I went and asked, like, how do I do this? This is really like, you have what I want. And he ended up letting me know, like, I could, send him a check and he would send me the armor. Not the armor he was wearing. He knew how to get an armor kit. And so he sort of acted as a middleman and ended up later that summer I got one. And I put it together. I didn't really do anything with it because I wasn't really aware of what conventions were at that time. it wasn't until college that Star Wars Celebration 3 rolled around. That was in Indianapolis. And that would have been in 2005, I think. And that was like, all right, I think it was right over a spring break or right near a spring break. So I ended up just buying a plane ticket, packed up my armor, and flew out and met all the other Star Wars fans that were out there at the time. A lot of people in my garrison who I had not met in person, and just got to stand around, in a the big group picture, and that really sort of like, wow, this is like a thing I can do more of, and it was a couple more years before I started trooping officially with the 501st. I got out of college. I started I had some disposable income and a job and a car, so I could drive around my area in New England, and ended up going to all sorts of events. I went to parades. I was on stage with Weird Al. I did charity walks. Basically anything I could do that was like within a couple of hours driving distance. And that just, I fell into this community of people who have since become, extremely good friends, and, people who were, came to my wedding or in my wedding. And, anytime I traveled, I could reliably go and, find somebody who was in the 501st and just like, meet up with them at a bar or get a meal and just, the group is like a big, sort of like a big fraternity or big club. And in the way that, we have this sense of family that extends all over the world. So that's sort of where I started really getting into the cosplay world. I had, because through there I started going to conventions, a lot of the local ones that are either here in Vermont. There were some little like gaming cons that had sort of popped up that I would go to. It was like Boston Comic Con and Granite State Comic Con are in the region. And, once you build one costume, you're like, all right, what else could I build? So I built a clone trooper from Attack the Clones. And then I built, I made some other thing like the film Moon from 2009, Duncan Jones' sort of small indie science fiction film. I made a jumpsuit with all the patches. I found all the patches, got a great jumpsuit, and
oh, cool.
That's sort of my walking around costume because it's comfortable and it's a nice little deep cut because not very many people recognize it. I did Stargate. More recently, I did a Belter jumpsuit because that was. I'm a big fan of The Expanse. And, it's just like one of those things that I just sort of fell into the world of cosplay just because that's where my friends and, sort of found family are. And so that's sort of the cosplay part of my life. While this was happening, I was working at Norwich University and wasn't terribly thrilled with the desk job there. So I ended up sort of falling sideways into journalism. I interned with IO9 and wrote for places like Carcass Reviews and SF Signal, and I was able to sort of put my history degree to work because I was interested in sort of trying to figure out like where did science fiction come from and how did it evolve over time. So I wrote a history column for Carcass Reviews. For IO9, okay. I wrote a whole bunch of like space history and military science fiction stuff, and that was sort of like the weird mix of things that is my background falling into place that let me sort of I guess sort of brought me to this point. Like it's a mix of pop culture, it's a mix of history, it's a mix. Eventually I added tech journalism and entertainment journalism to the mix, and so it's all of those little various threads have sort of come together to be a really fascinating sort of tapestry of influences that is now the book. So the book itself is sort of the product of all that.
So do you see, as you mentioned, you're basically combining your background as a journalist, your background as a historian, focusing on a theme of cosplay, which you're very passionate about. What aspect of writing this book seemed to surface most? Was it the fan of the genre? Was it the journalist part of you, or was it the historian part of you?
A little bit of both and all of the above. There's okay. There's sort of a couple things that came out of that. One is that it's I really wanted to sort of approach it from a journalistic perspective. Like and which is to say asking questions and sort of asking why
Okay.
is this phenomenon why has it become mainstream in the past couple of years, and it really has. It's a lot more people, certainly from when I started, more people know what cosplay is than before, and
Right.
by a long shot. And I would credit that to things like shows like The Big Bang Theory, or yeah, like just this past week, Miss Marvel, where cosplay is like a plot point, and Game of Thrones is a water. I don't know if we really have water coolers anymore. A water cooler topic, and Marvel Cinematic Universe, is just printing money for Disney.
Right.
Those that sort of fandom that surrounds these things doesn't come out of nowhere, and so I was really interested in trying to figure out where did fandom come from. So originally, this book was supposed to be a history of the 501st Legion. My
Oh, wow.
my original editor approached me about, I think I looked it up recently, it was about 2016. He had come from San Diego Comic-Con and had heard about like a story with the 501st. It was like, is there a story here? And so we put together an outline, and that particular version didn't go anywhere. But as I was sort of developing the project, I realized that in order to really tell the story of what the 501st is, and this is not a 501st Legion book, but it does play a big role in the book. Where does this particular group fit in the middle of all this? And you can't just sort of drop it in the middle, drop it for an audience and say like, this is what this is this group that cosplays, without sort of explaining what that is. And so I had known, I'd written about fan history for a long time, or science fiction history, and a lot of that comes out, talking about fandom. So I was really interested in what that origin was. So cosplay, you can go back to the date or the 1980s, when the term is when the term is coined. It was a Japanese fan coming over and seeing these science fiction, seeing a science fiction masquerade at Worldcon, I think in Los Angeles. But then you say, all right, well, this con had a masquerade. So where did the masquerades come from? And then you sort of you backtrack through the decades, and all right, well, it was a big part of these science fiction conventions that had been running since 1939. So you sort of go back all the way to there and sort of figure out what the progression is. And then you sort of go back and look for even earlier examples of what cosplay is. Why are people all the way back to the question of why are people dressing up? What is the purpose of why we dress up in costume? And ultimately, my definition of cosplay is basically somebody is exhibiting fandom. They're expressing their love for a story or their appreciation for a story by dressing up as a character and sort of trying to bring that character to life for just a little bit. And it's a very broad definition, but it's one that I thought was, you can't really limit it to franchises or to just science fiction fantasy stuff. I don't think.
Right.
And when you sort of broaden it out like that, you sort of also look at other things that are sort of similar. So like I cover reenacting in the book. Like why is reenacting popular? What is living history? How is the act of dressing up in a costume? What relationship does that mean for us to a story? And we are storytelling creatures. We if you go back to the first humans, we were probably picking up sticks and like smearing mud on your face to sort of make the story just a little bit more real. And so that's what I think is the sort of the core tenet of cosplay, is this idea of trying to bring the unreal into reality somehow. Again, even if it's just for a brief moment, even if it's not necessarily just in character, I still get chills whenever I see somebody dressed up as Darth Vader coming towards me. And it's that visceral reaction, I think, is why it's so important, and it's such a fascinating thing to tackle and take a look at, because you're bringing something that was previously just imaginary to life, and that I think is a really cool thing to do, because there's no possibilities, and it's a fun thing. It lets your imagination run wild. It's sort of I think the concept of play is underrated for adults, because we're still human, and we like playing as kids and we like playing as adults, and it's just another thing that we can do. So that's a roundabout way that the core of this book came about.
Do you see? You mentioned earlier that as you say, cosplay kind of took off in the last few years, and kind of you also mentioned the origins of it. Did you were able through your research to find that definitive moment where it really took off? Was there a certain cultural event that happened that really brought it to the forefront?
I'll preface this by saying I don't think that I don't really subscribe to, or I don't really think that history is a singular moment for anything.
Okay.
And this is sort of a weird peculiar detail in my background. I minored in geology in college, and there's a sedimentary rocks was something I was particularly fascinated by. And the fun thing about sedimentary rocks is that it's a rock made out of other rock that has been squished and pressured into stone. So like sandstone is made of sand, siltstone is made of silt, and as you layer these things up over time, you don't really have all these really hard and fast definitions. Like sometimes you will, but you have a lot of these formations sort of merge into other things. Like like you might have them sort of taper out into a different type of rock eventually. There's obviously exceptions. That's a very broad generalization, but like I like the idea of that. You sort of have all these sort of tendrils sort of come together, and slowly something ends up. Now you do have some hard and fast moments where people start to do this. 1939, July 1939 is one good example. But I think when you're talking about like something as big as a cultural movement, you have lots and lots of little elements that come together to sort of build this stuff up. So if I had to go back and sort of point to anything that might have been sort of like the last snowflake that sets off a snowmobile, or sets off an avalanche. One example might be the TV series Lost, because what that show did is it was a weird science fiction-y, fantasy, horror-ish, thriller-ish show that got a lot of people really interested in sort of genre fiction. And what that did is it got people talking about TV in slightly different ways, and there's a reason why it had sort of this big cultural footprint. It got a lot of people talking about it, a lot of people watching it, whether or not they liked the ending or not. I don't think that's really relevant. It was just it was a thing that really got people to talk. And what that show did, and with some others like Battlestar Galactica around the same time, it got people just a little bit more interested in science fiction and fantasy stuff. And a couple of years later, you have Iron Man come out, and that was like a huge blockbuster, superhero film that got it took the subject matter seriously, and a lot of people watched it, and then people kept watching it, and then a couple of years later, you have Game of Thrones come out, and that got people obsessing over these chunky, doorstop of a novel that had been written by a fan. There had been a niche obsession for a small group of people for a long time. And then you have I'll point again to the Big Bang Theory, which is a TV show that made fun of nerds, but then it became a lot more earnest as it continued on. And that I think was a lot of people's first introduction to sort of nerd culture. You have this group of friends who are obsessed with comic books and going to Comic-Con and the latest TV show and all the the movies and Star Wars, and they had opinions about this stuff, and it was recognizable to people who had been fans for years, but it was also just a sort of a first step for a lot of people who might not have been in that culture. And I think all you need is sort of that idea that like, oh, I like these things. I guess I'm okay with calling myself a nerd, or, I guess, oh, I didn't realize that people dressed up, but I like doing that. So maybe I could try doing that. And so I think that's sort of where these things sort of really, and, alongside this, you have, Comic-Con becomes really big, I think, because of a lot of those factors. Dungeons and Dragons has become this massive phenomenon. So I think there's a lot of these little things that sort of grew, and they just sort of culminate into this big thing. And all of that is sort of it benefited from having this big platform of people who are in the 501st, people who are in the anime community, people who are in the comic book community, Star Trek community, who had been dressing up for years and had, set the ground stage for a lot of the stuff. Like the 501st had been around for a long time. We had people who knew how to make prop replicas, and we had people who, knew how to make costumes out of foam, and there's these vast networks of fans who went to anime cons and knew how to make these costumes. And so that what the modern movement we have now would not have happened without the folks who had come in the decades before.
Right. We had Greg Giordano
said,
Greg said the earliest I ever heard was Forrest J. Ackerman and Myrtle R. Douglas, who dressed as characters from the 1936 film Things to Come at the 1939 World Science Fiction Convention. Was that the 1939 you were mentioning earlier?
Yes. They were sort of the first I would say like the first recognizable cosplayers.
Okay.
Not quite what we have as for like the modern day stuff. I'll get to that in a second. But like they were like, it has all the right ingredients. There's a couple of nerds, they have costumes, and they have a convention, and they are hanging out with their fellow nerds. And so it was funny because Myrtle, she was also known as Morojo it was her Esperanto name. She made the costumes. Forrest gets all the credit, but she made the costumes, and she accompanied him in costume and wore those for a couple more World Cons in the years that followed. Then they broke up, and it seemed like they sort of split permanently.
Oh, okay.
And then she died not too long thereafter. I remember correctly. But yeah, that was sort of like the modern. That was sort of like the spark. Like there's enough like sort of ignition material there, like the environment, there's fans, there was people willing to go meet each other, and so he was like he was the first one. The two of them were the first to really to do that, and everybody sort of looked at them like, what the hell are you doing? This is weird. But then the next year in Chicago, more people showed up in costume, and Forrest Moreau, they dressed up as the same characters. People joined them. They went down to a newspaper office and told the very confused editor, like, hey, we're here we're time travelers from the future. We're here for the interview that is going to run in tomorrow's paper. And they also got accosted by some police officers who were like, what are you doing? You guys are weird. And one of them had to show his like government ID to basically say, no, we're not cranks. We're just kind of strange. And then they went again to Denver, and then again to all the other World Cons that followed. And that's sort of where the convention masquerade scene came from. Now, there's some examples that I found that came before that. There was a random cartoon strip called Mr. Skygak from Mars up in the northwest of the United States. And a couple people had dressed up in costume contests as that character. It was like like the Strange World comics that had come out, with people making weird observations or these aliens making these very literal observations. There's a little bit like that. And so there's newspaper articles of people like dressing up as these characters. And then you go back even a little bit further. Jules Verne had dressed up as he had a costume party at his house, and people came dressed up as his character.
As you're putting the book together, what were some of the things that you discovered about cosplay that you were surprised to learn?
What was I surprised to learn about putting the book together? How complicated it is to sort of... So this is a little... I don't really have anything to work against other than the anthology I did. There's a lot of moving parts, and the result... What I went into with the original outline definitely looks different from the final product. Both in a lot of the stuff is similar. Like some of the structures is a lot of the same. A lot of the bits that I sort of figured I'd have to write about the same. But there's I'm trying to think of like the best way to put it. Like there was definitely things that I learned along the way that sort of nudged it in different directions. Like just sort of getting a better understanding as I worked, the idea of like how economics works when it comes to like access and equity in a fan community. So really good example of this mid 1990s fandom, like, it was, the replica props world and 501st world was expensive. Like, you would, I want to say Alvin Johnson spent thousands of dollars on the Stormtrooper costume that he wore for the first time in 97 for the special edition. So that's where the 501st comes from. That price point puts it out of reach for a lot of people, especially like a 15, 16-year-old fan. But also, like, a lot of like that world was sort of locked away behind forums that you sort of had to know people to get you into it. Over the decades, that's changed quite a bit. So you have platforms like YouTube, which can provide you with pretty much any building technique you ever want to know. If you want to know how to build a Stormtrooper, go into YouTube right now and type in build a Stormtrooper, and I'm pretty sure you'll get a crap load of tutorials. You find the same thing for how to build a costume, armor out of foam, or how to make, to wire up a costume part so that it lights up, or any other number of things. And those are, that access to information opens up the field to a huge number of people. The changes in costume material. So you can make a Stormtrooper out of ABS plastic. You have to know the right people, and you have to have a vacuum forming machine, or all this other equipment, or you could buy it, a kit. And that that takes money and costs. But you can also go out to Joann Fabrics or even just Walmart and buy a EVA foam mat, and with the right directions and the right tools, you can cut it and make it look like a Stormtrooper. Like, foam is a really wonderful building material. I think that was probably like the biggest revelation I had, is that, this is cheap, and that makes it possible for more people to do this. And that's not to suggest that there's a lessening of quality. You can make amazing stuff out of foam because it's just a versatile material. It's really flexible. You can bend it and heat it and shape it cut it into any shape you want. And so that's a really neat thing right there. 3D printers, the prices come down on 3D printers for the last decade, in part because the patents expired. Before, a company would have had to license the technology in order to make a machine. And now, as those patents have expired, they're no longer in effect. Companies all over the place can make their own versions of 3D printers. And so the price dropped. A snap maker down in my basement, and that was only a couple $100. And so when you drop a piece of equipment from, hundreds of, maybe tens of thousands to thousands to hundreds of dollars, that opens, more and more people can buy it. It's sort of like the personal computer. It was once as big as your house, and now it's, fits in your pocket.
Right.
That means more people can use it. So I think that was the biggest revelation I had, is that just how cost and secrecy can be barriers to entry in this hobby. And that was a big revelation. And I think, it's important to understand that, I think, because what happens is that you go from a field and a fandom that only a very small number of people can really actively participate in. And now you have a hobby that millions of people can take part in. People from whom, again, might not have been able to afford like a full suit of armor, but now they can put their creativity and their skills to better, they can actually put them to use. And that expands what it means to be a fan. And along the way, there's problems that get associated with that, because anytime you have massive change like that, you've got blowback from traditionalists and people who are like, oh, well, those are the wrong types of fans coming in. And there's certainly issues to be overcome there, but access, I think, is, it builds that community. And that sort of led me to the core of the book, is that this is a story about community. It's about people finding a shared love and finding other people that out there in the world that like the same thing. I know I certainly found tons of people who I never would have come across in a million years if I hadn't been part of the 501st, and some of the people who are my closest friends, because we love this thing and we love the idea of building these costumes and dressing up as them and going to cons or going to charity events or whatever. And every time I go to a con, you run into people like and you make fast friends, and that's a great thing. And
Right.
I think ultimately that's what I hope people get out of the book, is that, this is a story about fandom as a force for good, and it's a force for joy in the world. So
Now,
sorry,
I'm
that got a
kind of
little
curious.
rambly and a little sappy from the original question, but
No, it's good. So I'm kind of curious as well. Is as you're doing research for this book, and did you discover that there is a lot of within the culture of cosplay, that there's subcultures, whether it be based off of anime or fantasy or different Harry Potter? Was there different subgenres of cosplay within the community?
oh yeah, like every franchise has its own like hardcore group of folks. Like I'm certainly in the Star Wars camp when it comes to that.
Right.
Um, and that like that's how I came up in fandom, was through Star Wars fandom.
Right.
This is actually another thing that I talk about in the book, is that because this is a story about community. It's a story about, you go from this like 1939 fandom was one thing, really. It was people who are fans of science fiction magazines and comic books, and it was all very literary based. Like there wasn't like a bit like
Okay.
there were some movies out there, and you didn't really have hardcore thing to come fans who except for Forrest Ackerman, I guess, but like they didn't like set the public on fire because they were really had to consume this one thing like we have today. Fandom was really like this one small group of people who read the magazines, they read the books, they corresponded with one another through clubs, and went to Worldcon and regional cons and stuff like that.
Right.
That all changes in 1966 when Star Trek comes out. And what Star Trek does is it's another one of those access things, because it's on a mainstream channel, and it wasn't like the highest rating show to ever. But
Yeah.
what happened is that in the first like Gene Roddenberry came out of that fan group, and he actually had a lot of writers who were within fandom, and coming and writing on the show, so it was very closely tied to that. But what it did is it introduced a lot of people to fandom. So you have more women than ever showing up and becoming fans. But you also have people who are just Star Trek fans. And some of the people I talked to were like a little miffed about that. They're like, we really wish they would have come over and like explored like the rest of science fiction fandom. But like, these are people who really just like Star Trek. And they started doing their own conventions, their own cons, and their own magazines, and they had their own fan circles. And so that's sort of the 1966, 1967, 79. That's when fandom starts to sort of splinter a little bit, because now you have people who are just Star Trek fans, and then Star Wars comes out in 1977. You've got a massive, more people join fandom,
Yeah.
but you also have people who are just basically just Star Wars fans. They're not really interested in the books, and that's fine. And then 1980s rolls around, you have all these other big blockbuster films come out, and you've got more people joining fandom. Anime becomes a thing, and again it sort of comes back to access, because Star Trek really got big because it was on public access TV, and it was on reruns and syndication all over the place. The same thing happened with anime came over mid 20th century, and it started people would dub it, or sort of fans would dub it and pass it amongst themselves. You had sort of like the TV networks playing it, because it was just content that they could broadcast. And so you sort of, again, people start to sort of find it where they are, and then they come into these much larger communities. So this sort of balkanization of fandom has been around for decades, and it's particularly fascinating because you have fans coalesce in these little tribes. I don't particularly like the boundaries. Like if someone's a fan of one thing, there's a connection there. There's sort of like these like overlapping circles. So like if you're a Star Wars fan, you're a fan. If you're a Star Trek fan, you're a fan. You have that sort of passion in common. And what's kind of funny is that was it last year? Yeah, last year I went to go to Gettysburg to one of the reenactments on the anniversary of the battle over in Pennsylvania. And
Right.
a lot of those, I was talking to one of the guys who was manning a cannon, and he was like, oh yeah, we have this, we've got groups that we talk in, and we spend a lot of money on the cannons and uniforms. We try to get them all right. And a couple weeks earlier, I'd gone to World War II weekend and talked to some of the guys who were dressed up as American soldiers, and they were exactly the same as like other members I've met of the 501st. They're all interested in roughly the same thing. They want to get the costume they want to get the uniforms right. They want to get they really connect with that level of history and that story of history. And so, I think that there's a lot of common ground between fans, whatever
Right.
they're suiting up as, whether it's somebody dressing up as a stormtrooper or somebody dressing up as a allied paratrooper or as a infantryman or a cavalryman from the Civil War. And so that's sort of, you have all these tribes sort of moving in the same direction, but they're all still fans.
So that brings up a good point, is because you do have historical reenactments. Now, is that, looking at it from a genus species level, is there a larger family or genus of that fits within the Renaissance fair folks, the historical reenactment folks, and the cosplay folks? Is all that technically cosplay, or is cosplay its own separate thing because it kind of follows IP, for instance?
I think IP is a good way to look at it. Like cosplay is usually just replicating a fictional story. So I guess if I had to put it in biologic terms, you could probably call like reenacting and living history and Renaissance fairs sort of like really close cousins. One of the things I didn't get to write about in the book, and I hopefully I will at some point, is furries is another sort of one of those sub groups that is, again, really closely related, even if they're not quite replicating like what they've seen on a film or on a TV show or in a book cover or whatever. So I think, cosplay sort of, it's sort of the act of playing with a fictional story, but it's still playing, but then the overarching sort of the overarching branch that comes above that is like you're playing with you're interacting with the story by dressing up in costume as like the big funnel, and then it sort of splits down into some smaller ones, and it splits down into some smaller ones. So you've got costuming, fictional or non-fictional, and then you have like science fiction IP, and then you've got Star Wars, and then you might have the bad guys of Star Wars, the good guys of Star Wars, and then the stormtroopers, and then this particular type of stormtrooper, and it's just rabbit holes all the way down. And I imagine that the same is true with reenacting. Like you might have a casual reenactor, but then you have like World War II, World War I, American, German, UK, Soviet, so forth, and then you go down like, all right, we are the paratroopers, we're the tankers, and so forth. So I think there's ways to really sort of split the hairs there, but ultimately, again, you're all in this big bucket that fandom. You're a fan of this of this story. So
like, it's amazing to think about, just even from a genealogy perspective or from a family tree. Like, what's the base root with this? What is it? Costumes from plays? Like, was it theater?
And we sort of, in the book, we sort of trace this back a little bit. I do go back and sort of like, where did costume, like where does clothing come from? Like there's an environmental element to where you're trying to protect yourself from the world, but there's also, what are you signaling to people that based on what you're wearing? But we look at like costuming didn't come out of thin air. Like it was a ceremonial thing. And it pops up all over the world. It's not, a lot of, one of the things I found while I was researching this is that like a lot of theatrical history it comes out of like, the Greek tradition and European tradition, but you have people dressing up in elaborate costume, and costume, I mean, just mean clothing, all everywhere. And I think that is a very primal thing for us. Like, we want to sort of immerse ourselves in these characters and in these stories. And the idea of just trying to bring the imagination to life, I think, is probably the most basic root of all of this. And you can do that a bunch of ways. You can make movies, you can draw comic books, you can write novels, you can make costumes. And yeah, so like over the years, like the way we've costumed, it becomes more sophisticated with time. It used to be, you might just be standing on before a crowd. Then you have stages. Then you have more elaborate stages. You bring in costume. There's entire movements about realism, or how do you add more fidelity to your story by the trappings that you have around you. And right. If you're standing on a stage and you have a very elaborate set and you have very elaborate costumes, you can bring that story a little bit more life, I think. Or in some cases, there's movements against that sort of thing, where you might want to just leave it more up to the audience's imagination. And then you move up a little bit further, and you get to the point where we have movies coming out, and Hollywood comes about, and then we sort of connect back up to the 1930s. So as I said, there's always something more. You pull in the thread of history, you can always find a little bit more and a little bit more. Right. And the further you dig, the more you will find. And at some point, you just have to write the book and get it right. packaged into 300 or so words.
If people want to buy this book is available soon, as of this recording, at Simon and Schuster, correct?
That's right. So the release date is June 28th. That's Tuesday, June 28th, and it's available everywhere. Amazon, Bookshop. If you go to Simon Schuster's webpage that you've got displayed there, it'll have all of the retailers that you can order online. You can also go to your local indie bookstore and buy copies from them. You can order Perfect. It. You can ask your library; they should be able to get it. If you want to buy signed copies and you're here in Vermont, I'll be signing copies for the Yankee Bookshop down in Woodstock. We'll have a launch event at Phoenix Books in Burlington, and I'll be up at Rail City Rail City Fan Expo, which is the first time they've run that. It's a little convention up in St. Albans, June 25th and 6th. So I'll be up there, and I imagine that they will have the Eloquent page is the bookstore up there. They'll have copies. A couple of people who have bought the book online have actually already gotten their copies, which is kind of fun and irritating because I have not gotten my copies yet. I'm still waiting for them to arrive. So, and my editor has been taunting me with pictures that she has seen, that she has a copy that she's been taking pictures of and sending to me. And it's, I just don't have mine yet. So it does exist. People tell me. It'll also be ebook and an audiobook. Eunice Wong does the narration, and she's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to really listening to her narrate it. I haven't heard her work on the book yet, but it's really just like her work. I'm a big fan of, and right. I'm looking forward to people can listen to it if that's sort of more their jam. So it's coming. As of like this week, it's just a couple more weeks, so it's pretty exciting.
Cool, excellent. Well, listen, Andrew, it looks like you're gonna have to come back on when you have your other book published. If you're gonna have your book on furries or something, right? Yeah.
Well, one of the things I'm hoping to do is this was a book that I was like contracted to write like 80,000, 90,000 words, and I ended up turning in like 125. And we literally ran out of space on the acknowledgments page at the very end of the book because we went down to the last line and I couldn't add anything else. So there was a lot of stuff that I didn't get around to doing. Furries was one. I really wanted to devote a little bit of time to writing about the Ku Klux Klan masking laws that sort of were enacted to sort of counter that group's influence around the U.S. Because that weirdly pop up at points like stop kids from dressing up in Halloween costumes. There was that. I wanted to write a little bit about sports fans dressing up as their characters or just sort of that relationship. So there's a whole bunch. I've got a little list somewhere, and I've got a newsletter, Transfer Orbit, that I'm hoping that over the summer, as I get time, I'll be able to write down some of these. Like I'm going to call them like lost chapters, and that's something that I'd like to eventually get to. and that's basically my place to add on like just my commentary and reviews and stuff that's going on in science fiction, fantasy, and things like that. So
excellent. Yeah, and if people want to, they can also go to andrewliptak.com and you have all your information. You got your blog there, you got your newsletter.
Newsletter sort of taken over the blog, but that's sort of where I do most of my writing these days. But yeah, that's where you can find me, and I'm on Twitter at Andrew Liptak, and on Instagram at Liptak AA, and that's actually where I did a lot of my I did some research, because that's where a lot of cosplayers go.
Right.
It's a visual medium. It makes a lot of sense that they would go there. And so I haven't taken the dive into TikTok yet, because I just don't want to get sucked down that rabbit hole. But that's another, and actually that's a thing I talk about in the book, is the role that social media and these platforms play is a big thing. So,
Perfect.
It's a fun add to all of this.
Right. Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Andrew, and look forward to following your success on the book.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate coming on, and this has been a really great conversation. So thank you for having me.
You're welcome.